I haven't heard the lady announcing. Now I've heard the lady announcing she's recording. Hello, everybody, and welcome to my talk this evening called Forager's Tales. And I just hope to give you really a bit of an overview of some of the kinds of stuff that goes on in my life as a forager and some of the things that I have encountered. You know, and sometimes life throws a few curveballs at you, and also maybe just to lead you on a bit of a journey through some of the intrigue that surrounds the link between animals and plants and fungi and things like this too. But first of all, just for the first sort of 3 or 4 slides, I'm going to try to tell you a little bit about myself. But before I even do that, I just want to introduce you to a diagram, because there's a thread here that's going to run through the talk just a little bit. And some of you may have heard of this already, some of you may have not. But this diagram represents the phylogenetic tree of life. So when all organisms get their genomes sequenced, often parts of those genomes can be traced to genetic sequences that go back into sort of older groups of organisms. And if you have a look at this diagram, you'll see the word LUCA at the bottom. LUCA stands for Last Universal Common Ancestor. And there's a little bit of DNA preserved from LUCA in every single form of life on Earth today. But LUCA was an organism that lived in the Hadean period, so around about 4.2 billion years ago. We have no idea what LUCA was, what LUCA looked like, or it's all pretty much just guesswork. But what we do know is there's a conserved segment of DNA that dates, we believe, from the Hadean period around 4.2 billion years ago, that's still found in every single life form today. So I believe there was a song by Suzanne Vega, Her Name is Luca, wasn't it? I think, going back a bit, it always reminds me of that. LUCA, the last universal common ancestor. And we're going to look at today, the topic really, when we're talking about foraging, is going to be pretty much all about the plants and the fungi. And, you know, just have a look at this diagram, because down on the bottom right of the diagram, you'll see the fungi there, along with the animalia, the animals. And you have to go sort of going anti-clockwise, go around a few categories before you get to the plants. But essentially, we're only looking at a tiny subsection of the tree of life. There were some big influences on this journey of mine, although I really was one of those kids who spent my whole time out in nature, sort of trying to understand what things were called and what they did. And the earliest pictures of me are with my head in a flower, actually, as a toddler. And I remember I used to collect the seeds from all of the bushes in all of my neighbors' gardens. And my dad, who knew a bit about plants, taught me all their names, and we'd put them in little envelopes and label them and stuff. And it was a big adventure back in the days when kids wandered free and weren't always accompanied by adults. I had a big adventure about the age of 7 when I walked about half a mile to the local garden centre, and found myself in there with my pocket money, you know, 50p or whatever it was. And there was sort of some young African marigold plants, and I bought a couple of those and took them home. And I remember that being a really exciting day for me, sort of age 7. But my dad was quite into foraging for field mushrooms and horse mushrooms. He didn't have a repertoire of lots of different gourmet mushrooms that he understood or knew about, but he just knew the 1 or 2 basic ones that probably his father had taught him how to find as well. And my mum was a massive country cook, so I also got into picking bullaces, which are a wild type of plum that grows in Wiltshire in the hedgerows, and hawthorn berries. We used to make hawthorn berry wine. We used to make jam out of bullaces and cherry plums and things like that. And I developed a sort of a strong link at an early age between the idea that things that you could pick in the hedgerow and out in the fields could turn into delicious, tasty food when you got home. But at the age of 14, this little fellow on the screen here was a big influence on my life, because I, as an over-curious 14-year-old with no proper books on fungi, and probably assuming that there were only as many fungi out there as years that I had lived, so I probably thought there were about 14 different types, decided that maybe I knew what this one was, and maybe I wasn't too sure, but at the end of the day, the long story cut short is that I poisoned myself. And these tiny little brown mushrooms that grew down by our garden gate under a big beech tree actually made me really, really ill. I didn't eat them, but the story is a long one, and we don't need to go into it here. But what I'm trying to say to you is that the fascination for fungi was really kindled at this point, because I realized that something tiny and brown that piqued my curiosity a little bit was able to actually make me very, very sick indeed for quite a long time. And I definitely didn't want to repeat that experience, but it also gave me a great sense of respect and awe and wonder, really, about what on earth was going on. So it took me many years to figure out what this mushroom was. It wasn't until many, many years later, until actually I met this chap, Roger Phillips. Well, actually, first of all, I met his book, I guess, probably about 10 years after I ate that mushroom, maybe a little bit less, and figured out what the mushroom was called by using Roger's book. Roger wrote a very famous book, Mushrooms and Other Fungi of Britain and Europe, which the edition that's out and about out there today that you can buy on Amazon is just called Mushrooms. And it details around about 12,300 different mushrooms that grow in the UK. There are actually somewhere in the region of 73, maybe 75,000 different mushrooms growing all over Europe. And the geneticists tell us that the global total of number of species is probably about 4.3 million species. So they are the most numerous in terms of their diversity of any group of organisms on planet Earth. But back in the day, there was an epiphany, a moment when I picked up a copy of Roger Phillips' book, Mushrooms, off of the probably the sixth form library bookshelf, and suddenly realized that, oh my God, there really weren't just 14 mushrooms out there. And perhaps I didn't have a clue what I'd found in the first place, and perhaps I didn't really know what had made me sick. And I started to really research and go down this deep, deep rabbit hole. Many years later, Roger and I became great friends, and he actually became the patron of the Medicinal Mushrooms Conference that I host. But sadly, he passed away last autumn, but he leaves a great legacy. He inspired many, many people to forage for fungi and other plants. He was a member of the British Mycological Society, and many, many volumes were published, on ferns and grasses and trees and all sorts of things. And above all, Roger was an amazing artist and photographer. I don't know if any of you here are old enough to remember the band Cream from the early 70s, but some of the album cover artwork, Roger was responsible for that. He was an amazing artist who also devoted a lot of his life to studying the life of King Arthur, actually. So Roger was a massive influence on my life, more and more so as I got to know him. But another great big influence in my life, so we've talked about the little brown mushroom, the frosted fiber cap, Inocybe maculata, and we've talked about the mushroom guru who taught me what it was, Roger Phillips. But another big influence in my life has been this gentleman. This is Ted Green, and he was the senior conservation consultant for Windsor Great Park, and he's probably a good bit older than he appears in that photograph now. But in my 20s, when I was getting into a career in nature conservation, I was lucky enough to be taken to meet Ted and in Windsor Great Park, and to talk about the value of the ancient trees there to wildlife, particularly to invertebrate populations and to fungi. And he made some really important points. which I'm just going to briefly summarize for you because they just make a whole lot of sense. One is that because fungi live in the soil and their spores are airborne, and also the spores are carried by water, rainwater, groundwater, etc., that in general, most trees that have fungi growing out of them have not been infected through a wound or something like that, which was pretty much the accepted opinion of arboriculturalists going back decades, if not centuries. But the majority of fungi living in trees actually are already present at the moment the tree's seed germinates. So if you think of an acorn, on that day when the acorn shell splits open and the first shoot comes out, the fungi are able to infect that seedling, that developing seedling. And in fact, some of the fungi are actually found in the parent tree and already in the embryonic seed at the point when it falls to the ground. They're not infecting at all, but they're passed on for generations. And I found this to be very, very fascinating indeed. Ted made the point that ancient trees, such as the ones that I grew up playing around in Savernake Forest near Marlborough, he said they were high-rise apartment buildings for invertebrates and fungi, and that we should start viewing them differently, not as sources of wood or timber, but that we must earmark some trees to grow on in perpetuity because they have a unique microclimate at their core. And as they start to decay and break down and become old, they become home to countless species of invertebrates, particularly beetles, lots of fungal organisms and bacteria, and they become entire ecosystems that live and persist for many, many years, hundreds of years, before they finally decay back into the soil. So for me at that age, that was all pretty mind-blowing stuff. It really changed my perspective. I never looked at a tree in the same way again. And I never looked at a mushroom in the same way again either. And I came to realize later on that some of the invertebrates that we are sort of concerned. Hello? Somebody's saying hello.
Get myself organized.
Some of the invertebrates that that live in these trees are species of conservation concern, and they also carry out their life cycle inside the fruiting bodies of fungi that are growing on those trees. So we got someone there who could maybe mute themselves. I think there's somebody who's breaking in.
I just muted everyone. Thanks, Fred.
Thank you. That's cool. So yeah, important stuff, important realizations, and Ted was another big influence in my way of thinking, really. Dear old Roger. And these kind of events coalesced, I suppose, in 2008, where I'd spent a long time living in this body of skin and bones after that poisoning experience when I was 14. The fascination around the fungi and all of the wildlife that revolved around them started to deepen. And I met some of these key individuals who influenced my way of thinking. And I started to think, well, I need to write a book. I've only written this one book so far, but I really loved the botanical artwork of a man called John Edward Sowerby, who was the grandson of James Sowerby, one of probably the most famous botanical artists of all times. James Sowerby was around in the late 1700s, and John Edward Sowerby was around in the middle of the 19th century, and he published a book called British Poisonous Plants in 1861, which was partly my own inspiration for writing this one, because I spent quite a lot of my time out in nature by this point, harvesting plants to use in medicine and as food. And I realized that if you were to try to teach somebody, let's say, to drive a car, you would not let them loose in that car until they knew where the brake pedal was and they knew how to recognize common hazards, because a car's a dangerous thing. And so what I saw was there were lots of books on wild food and, wild crafting herbal medicines and things appearing around the place, but pretty much none of them were teaching you about the poisonous plants first. And unfortunately, I actually think they did quite a nice job of the book, but the publishers just wanted a plant book with a few mushrooms in the end. So it really only does a token kind of lip service thing to fungi. But this was my effort anyway on my journey of creating a reference material for people if they wanted to figure out which native British wild plants out there might poison them, might be the hazards that they needed to avoid before they learned to harvest edible things. So these days I teach edible and medicinal plant foraging and traditional and modern survival skills like coracle building, herbal field medicine, herbal first aid. I harvest and eat as many different kinds of wild food as I can, and I do that generally every day, as well as also growing quite a lot of fruit and vegetables out in the garden using organic and permaculture related techniques. With my partner Tash, we run a small community herbal dispensary where we treat people from the village and the surrounding parishes for things, could be anything, ranging from digestive problems, sciatica, a grazed knee. Sometimes they want support with their immune system. They might be undergoing radiotherapy or chemotherapy, and they want some medicinal mushrooms to help with their immune system to make it strong. And also for anxiety, stress relief, insomnia, and addiction, for which I tend to use a combination of herbs and also auricular acupuncture, what's known as the NADA technique, which uses 5 points in the ear, which is actually, well, it's very beneficial. It's very, very good for stress relief and relieving insomnia. So that's what I get up to as a day job, all of those things. Annually, I co-organise the UK and Ireland Medicinal Mushrooms Conference, which is now in its 7th year. And I also run an online course over the winter and spring months entitled Exploring the Healing Potential of Medicinal Mushrooms, which is available to the general public, but also geared to practitioners like naturopaths, GPs, practitioner nurses, herbalists, etc., who can enroll on that course and gain some CPD, some continuing professional development from doing it. So that's what keeps me busy. And when you say the words herbalist, I found this meme on the internet and I found it quite entertaining, actually. You know, you've probably all seen these about your various different professions, what my friends think I do, what my parents think I do, what society thinks I do. But the one on the bottom right is actually pretty much what I do spend most of my time doing, which is either staring down at the middle of a flower somewhere, trying to figure out whether the stamens are longer than the sepals or something like that to figure out which species it is, or teaching other people about really the skills of botany, or also classifying fungi using fungal taxonomy skills. So here's the first one of my tales, really. This actually happened to me. This is a real life event, but I have altered the telephone number. So I came home one day to find a carrier bag literally nailed to my wooden front door with a note sticking out of it. And the note said, "Help me." I pulled the note out. It said, "Help me, I've eaten these. Call me on." And what an extreme sort of thing to do, actually. But it was really good that happened for this person, because I phoned them up straight away, obviously understanding that whoever it was, they must be feeling quite anxious because they'd obviously eaten some mushrooms and weren't feeling very well, and wanted to know what the story was. And it turned out that it was a lady. Her partner worked out in the forest and brought home these mushrooms, insisting that they were edible and that she cooked them. So she did. And they both sat down and ate them, and he was fine. And she wasn't fine. She was experiencing a lot of gastrointestinal distress. She was bloating and having stomach cramps and starting to feel very, very unwell. And she'd eaten them about a couple of hours before. So I called the number and spoke to the lady who, I can't obviously mention her name. And she relayed this story to me, but luckily she'd put a few of the mushrooms in the carrier bag and I was able to have a look in there. And this was the mushroom that you see on the screen, was the mushroom in the bag. And this is called the clouded agaric, also known as the clouded funnel. It's Clitosobe nebularis, that's its scientific name. And it's actually an edible mushroom. You know, her partner or husband was absolutely right. It is edible. He probably, I'm guessing he looked it up in a reliable field guide and managed to get the right answer. But the field guide, as so often happens, didn't really tell the full story about this mushroom. And so much of what I do when I'm taking people out is I spend my time telling people the stories of the plants or of the fungi. And that's what I'm really doing with you now. This mushroom is very popular in Romania. It's also very popular in Spain and parts of Italy. And we've got an Italian chef friend called Rocco who goes mad for them. You know, we can take him a tray of sort of 3 kilos of these and he will demolish the whole 3 kilos with pasta in one sitting and come back the next day asking for more. But the Spanish government a number of years ago banned the sale of this mushroom in Spanish food markets for the reason that around 15% of the Spanish population has a violent gastric reaction if they eat it. Okay, so when we say it's edible, really with a lot of these fungi in particular, we should really be saying it's edible with certain caveats. Most wild fungi are not edible in the raw state. Only a very small number are edible in the raw state. Some are only edible if they are boiled in brine and pickled and used as an antipasti. But if you fried them and omitted the boiling phase, they would actually still be toxic and at the very least cause a gastric upset. And in this case, this mushroom contains a gastric toxin, which around about 15% of people have a problem with, and the remaining 85% of society doesn't. Now, I tried this mushroom out on myself a number of years ago, and all I can say is I have renamed it. And if I ever manage to get my mushroom book out, its name is not going to be Clouded Funnel. It's going to be the Incredible Stinking Fart Trumpet is all I'm going to say it's called, because the amount of flatulence that I experienced after trying to eat even just a quarter of a cap of this mushroom was absolutely phenomenal. So I'm obviously one of the 15% of people who can't tolerate this mushroom. And really, there should be a warning that goes with that. But luckily, I was able to tell the person who left her calling card on a bag of mushrooms that she was going to be fine, that probably within 24 hours, she would feel perfectly okay, but that she shouldn't eat them again. And subsequently, she came out on a number of courses with me and learned to identify lots of really tasty, good, wholesome edible mushrooms that she then took home and fed to her husband, and hopefully didn't feed him any of the ones that I told her that she shouldn't do. So as I say, I changed the number on the slide here to the number of my favorite local Chinese takeaway, which is Wok Express in Caen. And so if you just wanted to write that down, because I have to say, it's the best Chinese takeaway for miles around. Good on you, Wok Express. Another thing that I'm involved with is this, this forum on Facebook. I don't really use Facebook an awful lot because I find it to be a bit of a sort of clunky, boring, bit of a chore really on the whole. But this is one thing that I do use it for, because I'm one of the international group of consultants who are involved with this forum, which is used not only by members of the public, but also by emergency room consultants, by vets, by all sorts of people. And maybe if you're interested in the world of foraging, you ought to note it down. And it's called Poisons Help, Emergency Identification for Mushrooms and Plants. You cannot and must not ever post a picture of something on here if you just merely want it identified. This is for genuine emergencies. So either yourself or your child or a friend, or perhaps your dog, cat or horse has eaten something from the wild and they are becoming unwell. And at that point, you really need some help. And if it's your child in particular, or another human being, there are 1 or 2 fungi you should realize that might not cause symptoms of poisoning for several days and after they've been eaten. So if somebody's eaten a mushroom and they don't know what it is from the wild, that also constitutes an emergency. This group was originally dreamt up by a lady called Kerry Woodfield, who is a chef and a forager. And I think she's now living down in Cornwall. It was her idea. It's now got 156,000 members. And the people who are on the list of consultants, such as myself, we get notifications even in the middle of the night. And depending on who's awake in a particular continent of the world, somebody will generally answer a query. If a photo has been posted, they'll alert other relevant consultants who've got expertise in that field. And the idea is that somebody with a good expert eye can run their eye over it and come up with an identification, or at least a pretty damn good match. If it's not 100%, then 95%. And what this means is then that the emergency room, or the toxicology center, or the veterinary hospital, or whatever, can be told what kind of thing that they've eaten, and they can look up what type of poisoning is taking place and treat it accordingly. And this service, and I will call it a service, has actually now saved quite a number of lives. We've had consultants contact us directly when we've dealt with cases to say, actually, that person lived as a result of the work that you guys did. And there was one night about 5 years ago, quite late, when I was kind of on the shift, and a lady in the southeast of England, a teenage girl, had been out with her friends picking sloes. And she'd eaten some sloes and fallen ill, became unconscious, was taken away in an ambulance. And every now and again, she surfaced, she came round, became conscious again. And we had her mother there by the side of the bed, and and a medical consultant in the emergency room, trying to talk to her, trying to go through the pictures on her mobile phone. And she came round enough at one point to say that she'd eaten star sloes. Now, star sloes is not really a thing. It's not anything I've ever heard of, okay? But if you start thinking about sloes and you start thinking about shiny purple black berries, there is one shiny purple black berry, roughly of the same size as a sloe, that has a star-shaped green calyx, a 5-pointed star-shaped calyx that sort of cups the berry on the bush, and that is deadly nightshade. That is belladonna, Atropa belladonna. And really quite a small number of berries would be fatal if consumed by a human adult, possibly as few as maybe 8 or 9 berries, perhaps even less. So as a result of her saying star sloes, I quickly looked up some pictures showing belladonna berries cupped by the star-shaped calyx, sent them through to the emergency room consultant. He was able to show the picture to the girl when she came round. And she, although she wasn't able to speak at that point, just put a thumb up. And as a result of that, she got the right treatment. And the thing about with Atropa belladonna, with deadly nightshade poisoning, as long as the liver is not too badly affected, there are antidotes that reverse the effects on the nervous system. And they were able to bring her around reasonably quickly, and she recovered after that. But the consultant said that there was a good chance they would have lost her if they didn't have that information. Recently, we also had a case where somebody went to the local hospital in the northeast of England, once again in England, having suspected that they'd been foolish enough to eat a destroying angel mushroom, a white relative of the death cap mushroom. And this is something that is often fatally poisonous. We'll show you a picture of the death cap in a little bit in this slideshow, but essentially if you eat the death cap or the destroying angel, the toxins in those mushrooms can result in systemic multiple organ failure, which basically means that you would feel a bit ill after maybe 6 or 8 hours, maybe up to 24 hours later, then probably recover. So you would have had some nausea, vomiting, bit of confusion, maybe a lapse of consciousness, but then you would recover. But by this time, and this is when most people approach the emergency services, damage would have already been done on a genetic level and on a cellular level to the cells in your liver, in your kidneys, maybe some brain damage too. And these cells cannot function properly, and they also cannot replicate anymore. So gradually all of the body's systems shut down, and it takes 2-3 weeks or more to die, and it's a really horrible way to go. There's no antidote for this type of poisoning. What's really shocking is that the reason I'm telling you this is that person was sent home. They said to the emergency room, well, I think I've eaten a mushroom in the death cap family. It might be a destroying angel. And it's in that group of poisonous mushrooms, and I'm feeling stupid now. I think I've eaten the wrong thing and I'm feeling stupid now. And can you help me? I'm not very well, but I'm starting to feel a bit better. And they actually sent this person home and said, well, you're probably past the time when toxic effects would now have occurred. And if you're feeling better, you're probably going to be fine. So they had no knowledge of these toxins known as amatoxins that are found in the death cap family mushrooms. So they had no knowledge that in order to save her life, the next steps ought to have been blood transfusions, possibly also dialysis. She might even need a liver transplant, you know, none of these things. She was sent home and told that she was probably going to be fine. So I'm really glad that this group, Poisons Help Emergency Identification for Mushrooms and Plants, exists. I'm really glad to be a part of it. And I'm really glad that it's increasingly being used by medical professionals and veterinary professionals around the world to really plug the knowledge gap, because they don't seem to be being made aware of the things that they need to know about. So now you guys all know about it too. If you use Facebook in particular, it's quite handy to know the name of it and join this group. But as I say, please don't submit a query unless it's a genuine emergency. One of the things I'm always being asked about as a forager is, what should we do and what should we not do? What is legal and what is not legal? Can I harm plants or fungi by picking too many of them? What is the impact of what I'm doing? So I produced this little kind of a code of conduct, I suppose, foraging do's and don'ts, just a little information sheet. And really, mostly it's common sense. But important things, obviously, when you're out foraging, follow the countryside code. Make sure you've got permission to take the things that you're going to take if you're on private land. That's just common decency and common sense. But we will talk a little bit more about the legality of that, though, in a second. Please don't trespass or damage land or property that belongs to somebody else. Please also close gates after yourself if they were closed when you found them, or leave them open if you found them open. Never pick more than you need. Human beings, we've lived through some really, really difficult times, and I suspect it's hardwired into our nature that when we find an abundance of something, which we should feel good about, because it's always amazing, right? It's always amazing when the entire forest floor is covered in acorns, or you're stood in what is like a sea of wild garlic, or you come across a patch of 1,000 field mushrooms. These are really, really lovely things. This is nature in full abundance, and it's to be celebrated and enjoyed. But I think as humans who've come through some very difficult times, and inevitably in our history, periods of difficulty and starvation where we had to keep our families alive and everything else, there's something almost hardwired into our psyche. And I think it's summed up in the expression, fill your boots. You know, when you see this going on, it's like, fill your boots. But nobody ever thinks, how much do I need? How much of it do I actually need? Things get wasted in this scenario. So when you find a lot of something, try to curb this aspect of human nature that goes, fill your boots, and ask yourself the question, how much do I need? How much will be enough to feed myself and perhaps my family? Okay, and if we all did just that one thing, it would make a really big difference. Because, excuse me, because in general, foraging from the wild's not a problem. Most of the things that people want to pick are actually still reasonably common, if not very common. Lots of goodness can be had from eating things like nettles, dandelions, and sloes. And really and truly, there's no problem with picking fairly large quantities of those things. But some of the other things that are out there that are really, really nice are still common enough to find regularly, but not common enough to take in any quantity. And hopefully I'll show you a couple of examples of that in a moment. So first of all, ask yourself, how much do I need for my own use, for my family's use? Secondly, ask yourself, how long is it going to take to process this lot? Because some of the processing techniques take a really, really long time. And the foraging's the easy bit. It's the really fun bit. The foraging's the bit where you do go out and fill your buckets, if not your boots. It's always great fun. But when you get home and it's now 8, 9, 10 p.m. and you're confronted with the reality of, oh my God, it's going to take 6, 7 hours to process this lot, and I've got to be up for work in the morning. And then you find it really takes 9 hours and you're still awake 2 hours before you should have been getting up for work. At this point, you're going to look at yourself and go, I wish I'd thought about this in a different way. Okay, so ask yourself how much you need. Ask yourself how much time you've got realistically to process what you see in front of you. Ask yourself if what you're seeing looks as if it's locally abundant. It's all very well talking about things like nettles and dandelions, which are pretty much in the south of England, abundant absolutely everywhere. But even then, in other parts of the British Isles, they may not be. I've spent 2 summers in the Outer Hebrides, the past 2 summers, and you couldn't find a nettle for within 10 miles. So it's all contextual. Is it locally abundant? Is it abundant where you are? Is there a lot of it? Is there enough whereby the local population can sustain itself if you take some? And what's perhaps more important is ask yourself, what change, how much change are you creating in the local ecosystem when you forage? Because you're sharing this food material, this abundance, with every other creature that inhabits that place. When you pick a mushroom, you're sharing that nutrition with the slugs that eat them in huge quantities, with the deer, with the badgers, with the squirrels that shred them using their front teeth into little strips and hang them on blackthorn spikes to dry before burying them for the winter. All of these other animals. And you're also sharing the fungi, fruit bodies, the mushrooms, with invertebrates. And in some cases, there are beetles that carry out their reproductive cycle inside the fruit bodies of only some species of mushrooms. So let's say you remove those mushrooms from a wood, that one species, on that one day. You could have broken the entire life cycle for that invertebrate species for that whole year, and maybe removed its presence from that site entirely. Our actions can have really big consequences. And I'm saying this as a forager, but most foraging is safe to do, providing we ask ourselves those kinds of questions first. And if we really immerse ourselves in what we're doing, take the time to find out about the plants and the fungi and the creatures that depend upon them as well. In terms of legality, foraging is a legal activity in the UK. It is a protected activity. Your rights to do it are protected by law. Under the 1968 Theft Act, where it actually states that it shall not be an offence to forage for the 4 Fs, fruits, flowers, foliage, and fungi, unless it is for commercial gain or reward. In other words, unless you're going to take them to the local market and sell them. There are some exceptions to this. The Wildlife and Countryside Act prohibits the foraging of certain named species that are on Schedule 8 of the Act, which are all endangered species. And also, it is illegal in the UK to uproot any wild plant without the landowner's express permission, also under the Wildlife and Countryside Act. But the act of foraging itself is perfectly legal. And if you are out on land where people walk their dogs, or there's a public right of access or whatever, and you put some acorns or crab apples or field mushrooms in your bucket or basket, nobody, not even the landowner, can come to you and say, you're taking my crab apples, you're taking my mushrooms, because they don't belong to the landowner. They belong to the person who has them in their possession. And at that point, once they're in your basket, they belong to you. And in fact, in that situation, if the landowner tried to take them off of you, they would be committing an act of theft. Completely different, of course, if we're talking about crops or planted trees that are fruit trees intended to provide a crop, because under the definition of the 1968 Theft Act, you would then be depriving the owner of those materials of the ability to use them or to sell them for a profit, and that would then become theft. But casual foraging is protected under UK law, and probably with very good reason, because in the Second World War, we started to run out of food. You know, we had lots and lots of people working on the land. We'd lost a lot of the people within the age bracket, mostly males, who had gone to help with the war and not come back. Our supply lines of imported food were all being cut off by the German U-boats, and our government issued 2 public service booklets to the general public, one on how to forage for plants and one on how to forage for mushrooms. And by assisting people to regain that old ancestral knowledge about what they could make use of, that really helped the war effort, because there was a great resource out there. We are, after all, social creatures, and we are great apes. We are one of the last of the great apes. And when we're talking about going foraging, we're talking about accessing our native habitat and our native food plants. And really and truly, that should be always a protected right. We are animals, after all, and we should have a right to access our own native food plants. But also, because we're human beings with hopefully a measure of intelligence that enables us to understand our impact on things, we also should have a great responsibility to look after those habitats. So let's do a bit of seasonal stuff. I just thought I'd show you 1 or 2 of the things I really enjoy at different times of the year. In the spring, I tend to like to go and make lots of wild garlic soup. And I also make a soup known as the spring cure. Excuse me. Now, in the West Country, the spring cure is written about in lots of old sort of folkloric books and cookery books and things like that. And basically what it amounts to is that once upon a time, we didn't have Waitrose, Sainsbury's, Morrison's, Lidl's, whatever. We probably didn't even have access to all of the ingredients we needed for a healthy diet from a local shop, in fact, in the winter time, because food production was very, very seasonal. And most people survived on lots of preserved foods and dried foods to get them through the winter, regardless of whether it was you know, meat or fish or vegetables or mushrooms or whatever. Basically, the meat would have been culled in the autumn and hung, and various things like sausages and other ways of preserving meats were done to make it, to spin it out longer through the winter months. Things like pickles and storing certain things like runner beans, etc., in jars were done. Chutneys were made, jams were made, various different ways of preserving fruit, sometimes in cider vinegar. But at the end of the day, we didn't have any fresh food in the winter, very, very little. And at the moment, we can go to the supermarket and buy food that was grown either in an artificial growing environment or was grown in some other part of the world. And I hesitate to say fresh, because lots of the fruit and veg that we buy is more than 9 months old by the time we consume it, because it's being kept in large chilled warehouses where oxygen has been sucked out and inert gases have been pumped in. So it looks great, but actually it's been standing around for a really, really long time, and it's likely to have very, very poor vitamin content at least. But nevertheless, we can get hold of what passes somewhat for fresh vegetables, fruit, etc., all year round. And this was not the case at all, even comparatively recently. When we were hunter-gatherers, and then when we became farmers, we became agrarian, it was all down to our ability to learn to store things and preserve things. That was what kept us going. But the problem with that was always that by the end of wintertime in this temperate zone of the world, we had pretty much run out of fresh raw ingredients, and we were getting quite run down physically. Some of you will have heard the term scurvy, which is a chronic vitamin D deficiency or insufficiency, which leads to lots and lots and lots of different illnesses, because vitamin C is required by every single cell in the human body But there are other deficiencies too along the same lines that came from eating only dried and preserved food. So in the spring, one of the first things that anyone did was they went out and they prepared the spring cure. The spring cure is a soup, and it's made by incorporating ingredients that are very rich in minerals and vitamin C, such as nettle tops, wild garlic leaves, a little weed called ground ivy that's actually in the mint family, that's got a sage-like flavor, maybe plantain leaves, maybe some dandelion, really quite a lot of different plants, pretty much anything that was coming up with fresh green edible shoots at that time of the year, in fact. But nettles was almost always the base, because nettles of any green vegetable, and I'm not talking about seeds, but leaves here, have got the highest protein content. They also have one of the highest vitamin C contents, more than 10 times stronger than citrus fruit, weight for weight. They're very, very rich in iron too. And they've got all kinds of medicinal benefits in supporting the liver function and kidney function that helps to clear toxins out of the blood after a long, hard winter where you've been fighting respiratory infections and getting run down and all the rest of it. So nettles usually were about 2/3 to 3/4 of the base material of the spring cure soup. Wild garlic was often put in if it was available in the locality where it was being made, partly for its flavor, but also because of its antibacterial, anti-infective qualities. If there are any lingering infections hanging around in the cold, damp days at the end of February, early March, the young wild garlic shoots would have been coming up, and you'd get those into your system and get the garlic in there. And with its kind of antibiotic, fiery nature, it would have helped to drive infections away. But essentially, that was what the spring cure was all about. And one of the things, one of really the great pleasures of foraging in sort of late Feb, early March, mid-March, is going out and getting these young tender leaves of these early wild vegetables. The process is very, very simple. If you consume butter, use butter, but if not, just use olive oil. And you put a knob of butter in the bottom of a saucepan, a little bit of grated garlic if you're using garlic, or you can put wild garlic leaves in, a little twist of salt and pepper. And you want to fill the saucepan up with the mixture of 3/4 nettle tops and 1/4 of these other edible wild herbs. Put the lid on, maybe put a couple of tablespoons of water in there, but no more, and turn the heat up slowly and wilt the whole pan down. After about 11 minutes, the volume in the pan has gone down to about 1/4 to 1/3 of what you started with. And it's almost ready. All you then do is, in this day and age, you'd get your blender or food processor, and maybe a stick blender is quite a good tool for this. Just whiz it up, cream the soup until it's thick and of an even consistency. And then swirl a bit of creme fraiche or yogurt or even cream in to finish the job off, and maybe garnish with a few chopped wild garlic leaves. And that makes a lovely spring cure soup. If you wanted a bit more thickness, you could parboil some potatoes that's chopped up fairly small, just to give it a bit of body, and add that in at the beginning as well, so that when you cream the soup, you get the starchiness of the potato as well. But in essence, it's a real, really traditional peasant dish from the southwest of England. And I'm sure similar things were made probably all over Europe, really. But this is our local version, spring cure. And it's delicious with crusty bread. Another thing that grows in the spring are these lovely mushrooms called morels. Now, there are different kinds of morels. The ones you're seeing here, this is the more highly esteemed, sought-after edible morel, but there are also small black conical morels that we tend to find in dried form in supermarkets in the delicatessen section. And those little black conical morels are now very common in the UK because they like to grow in conifer bark. They like to compost and break down conifer bark, and lots of bagged conifer bark chip that gets used for mulching flower borders and things like that is absolutely perfect for them. And in some cases, the spawn of this mushroom is already naturally present in that bark, especially if it's being imported from places like Germany. for a while, I don't know if they still are, Lidl's were selling conifer bark chip in their gardening range by the sack. And it was absolutely inoculated with these black conical morels. So every time I used it on somebody's garden, within a few months, these little black morels would be popping up and I'd be out there harvesting them. But nowadays, if you want to go and find the smaller conical black morels, the ones that you can buy in the supermarket, then the best places to look are shopping malls, retail parks, new housing estates where they're literally the houses have just come on the market. And of course, one of the ways they make the brand new gardens look pretty is by putting a few shrubs in and just pouring conifer bark chip all over the flower borders. The morels, if they're in there, if the organism is in there, the mycelium will start breaking down those conifer bark chips in layers, and it will, the following spring, generally, it will fruit with the morels. And usually it'll only fruit that one time, unless somebody brings some fresh bark chip along and tops the beds up and gives them a bit more food. Because once they've run out of sufficient food, they can't produce fruit bodies anymore. They don't have enough energy to do so. The morels in this picture, though, are very much the wild type that grows in ash maple woodland in the UK. And what I mean is woodland tends to be on limestone soils, dominated by ash trees and sycamore or field maple. And usually for these morels, you're looking for a ground layer that contains one of the types of speedwell, maybe creeping speedwell or ivy leaf speedwell. You might also be looking for ivy itself. You'd be looking for dog's mercury, and maybe a little plant called opposite-leaved golden saxifrage, which is a woodland ground cover that's also an edible salad, by the way. That is the perfect environment for these morels. So why have they got no morels? The reason is because they don't know the rules, guys. These two morels were found in somebody's runner bean trench in their garden. No trees around at all, not even on limey soil, just an old runner bean trench that had been used year after year with loads and loads of potato peelings and orange peel and all sorts of stuff dug into the bottom of it. And one year they just fruited with morels. Absolutely no idea why. In an area where they do grow within half a mile or a mile or so. But what I'm trying to say is that mushrooms in particular really don't always follow the rules. There are always some surprises, but morels are definitely a spring mushroom. You're not going to find them at other times of the year. Nighttime temperatures have to reach about 11 degrees C before the morels will start fruiting. That's their trigger. Once the nighttime temperatures in around about April get up to about 11 degrees, then if they stay at 11 degrees for 3 or 4 nights on the trot, you start going morel hunting. And they might be around for 2 or 3 weeks, and then it's all over for another year. But they were a real pair of beauties. You're all going to get a recording of this, so I'm not going to really read through these recipes for you, but they're there for you to try. And I've included them in the slides so that you can use them. One for a nice wild garlic aioli and one for a wild garlic pesto for you to use next spring. Another thing that tends to be a spring activity more than anything is foraging along the seashore. And the reason for this is that the majority of seaweeds are at their best in the spring. And also you've got the young tender shoots of things like samphire and sea beet coming up. But around about the spring equinox time, you're going to get a super low spring tide. And when that super low spring tide comes, the sea goes as far out as it's going to go for that whole year, really, exposing beds of seaweeds that are normally not exposed at all. So we have this intertidal zone that we talk about on the beach, where at the very top end, you get things like gutweed, the green floating tubular weed that floats in rock pools. And at the bottom end, you get things like kelp and sugar kelp that spend almost the entire year completely submerged in kelp forests below the low tide mark. And then in between that, you get all sorts of things like dulse, pepper dulse, carrageen, the various racks like bladder rack. I'm sure you all know what bladder rack looks like, the green seaweed with the kind of egg-shaped bladders on the fronds lying around all over the beach. Well, bladderwrack's a good edible seaweed, actually. It's a staple in places like the north of Norway and in Greenland and even in parts of Iceland. And the young spring fronds, the ones that are a sort of paler green color, can be diced and chopped up like little matchsticks, similar to the way that you would dice up young carrot. And they've got a very carrot-like texture. They're also full of a polysaccharide, a sugar chain called fucoidan, which is very, very good for your skin, very good for the complexion, and also very, very good for the immune system. You can eat bladderwrack raw, and in fact, you can eat all of the seaweeds around our coastline raw. None of them need cooking. And it's an absolute genuine fact that all of the seaweeds that grow around the UK coastline are edible. None of them are toxic. A few of them taste really peculiar, and you probably won't want to try them a second time, but they're all safe to eat, and none of them are toxic. And around our waters, there is only one toxic weed, and it's something that grows way offshore. You won't find it attached to the rocks or the beach or anything around the coast. So seaweeds are really great to experiment with. They've got some unexpected flavors. There's one called pepper dulse, which is a very small weed that grows over rocks that are strewn on the beach, over large rocks. And if you look at the individual little fronds, it almost looks like a bit of a Leyland cypress or something that might be growing in your garden hedge, like a Leylandii hedge, but it's growing over rocks and it's actually a seaweed. And it's called pepper dulse for a reason, because it's got a really peppery after kick. It's also got a very complex flavor. There's a lot of iron in the flavor. It actually tastes almost a little bit like you've bitten your cheek. You've got a slight taste of fresh blood going on, as well as the peppery kick and some really aromatic tastes that come from different terpenes in the seaweed. And for this reason, it's called the truffle of the sea, this weed. It's expensive, a real gourmet ingredient, but very common actually around southern Britain. Very easy to find once you know what you're looking for. And it might surprise some of you to know that the seaweed called nori, okay, the one that we get in sheets often in our supermarkets, there's a brand called Itsu, I think, that does it, sort of nori flakes or nori chips and all sorts of things. These Japanese seaweeds, and in particular this one, nori, is actually harvested around the UK coastline. In fact, in South Wales, near Llanelli, the nori is harvested and exported to Japan, where it's remanufactured with the addition of starches and fillers and all sorts of things, and then pressed into sheets and then repackaged. And some of that is coming back to the UK, presumably in brands like Itsu. So we're actually exporting a really great food product from South Wales. It's the same seaweed that's used to make lava bread, purple lava. It's the same one. Nori is the same seaweed. We're exporting it all the way across the world to be turned into convenience food, to be shipped all the way back again in several layers of packaging. And that's shocking. It's one of the reasons why I think everybody should learn to forage, because actually in situations like that, our impact is far lower if we just go and put the effort in ourselves and only just gather enough for our own human need. And you haven't got all the packaging and all the food miles, and we're distributing our impact around the world rather than focusing it in places where that just get devastated to feed the commercial trade, and then whole populations of things get wiped out. Instead of doing that, we're spreading our impact much more thinly. This is more of an early summer thing, late spring, early summer. You heard the expression gathering nuts in May. Well, here I am holding up a freshly dug pig nut. And on the blue mat at the bottom there, you should be able to see the pig nut after I've washed the soil off. And there's a picture of the pig nut leaf as well, and the flower. The pig nut is actually in the carrot family. It's a member of the Apiaceae, the carrot family. And it's really quite a small plant with a very delicate feathery leaf. It tastes absolutely fabulous. It's somewhere in between a water chestnut and what would it be? And a hazelnut. It's got a papery skin, a bit like a hazelnut, but it's knobbly. And if you eat 3 or 4 of them and chew them for a while, it does develop a very slightly peppery aftertaste, which is really pleasant. But it's a real delicacy. Presumably it's called pignut because once upon a time, pigs used to forage out on ferny ground, the sort of ground in between the cultivated zone and the wild forest. And going back to Anglo-Saxon times, I imagine the pignut was quite an important food source for pigs. But nowadays it's getting to be quite scarce. I know of some meadows where there are thousands of these plants, but there are others where there are only a dozen or so, and there are others with none at all. So if you're going to harvest pignut, it's still okay, providing you get the landowner's permission, of course, because it's a root. But please don't take more than half a dozen or a dozen or so just to try them. Don't think that you're going to go and harvest bucket loads of pignuts. A, because it would take you weeks to do so. You just couldn't do it. You'd burn more energy in trying to find them than you could possibly ever get from eating them. And B, because it would just be a real shame. So it's something to include as a gourmet ingredient in really small quantities, maybe toasted, mixed in with a green salad that's dressed with balsamic or elderberry vinegar, something like that, and a drop of walnut oil. But you really only need half a dozen or a dozen of these beauties to make a dish really great. You really don't need to gather it in any quantity. It's lovely though. So you're looking at the second half of May, maybe early June, and the biggest pignuts are found on sandy soils. Moving on to the summer, some of the things I like about summer, and there are too many. I mean, there are thousands of things I would be out harvesting in the summer, but I just thought I'd pick on a couple. So we have this beautiful bright yellow shelf mushroom, the chicken of the woods, Laetoporus sulphureus. And the reason it's here is because providing you've got a bright yellow, flat shelf-like mushroom growing from a tree trunk, and providing it's got no gills underneath, no mushroom gills, then you have got chicken of the woods. It's very, very easy for a complete beginner to identify. It must always be eaten when it's lovely and fresh and yellow like this, and not when it's turning a dingy brown color, because it can actually cause nausea and vomiting if you eat an old specimen. And it must be well cooked. It can also lead to a bit of nausea if it's undercooked. So you cook it weight for weight as if it is chicken. You literally weigh it out, assume it's chicken breast, and cook it in all of the ways that you would normally cook chicken breast. It can be turned into schnitzel, for example. It's beautiful as schnitzel, but weight for weight, that will determine your cooking time. Down the bottom there, I'm making a syrup with rose hips. This is Rosa rugosa, the beach rose or Romanus rose, which is planted by local authorities in all of our council parks around the towns. It's usually planted around the edge, and the reason is it's very thorny, so any litter that blows off the road tends to get stuck on the thorns and doesn't blow across the park or the playing field, which is pretty cunning. But it's also one of the best roses to use for food. All rose hips are edible though, all kinds. The seeds inside the rose hips have to either be sieved out through muslin using a jelly bag, or if you're just drying the rose hips whole, you can include them whole in that, in your ferment if you're making wines, or you can dry them whole to make herb teas, where they taste quite a bit like hibiscus, sort of sour but refreshing, fruity flavor. So I love rose hips, and rose hips and ginger is a really good thing to have in the winter. If you make a syrup, you've got the vitamin C of the rose hips, and you've got all of the kind of heating antibacterial properties of the ginger. Very good for the winter colds and flu season. And then after the summer, we get into the autumn. And this is the time for me, not only of fungi, but also for harvesting nuts. This is a picture from this year's nut harvest, and this is actually acorn. This is the English oak, okay? It's a tremendous source of food and medicine. Acorns are really high in protein and really high in fats. They are actually nutritionally more dense than the majority of other nuts that we regularly eat. But they have to be leached before you can use them. And what that means is that you dry the acorns by just putting them in trays with air flowing between them for a few weeks, couple of weeks or so, until you can pick them up in your hand and rattle them, and they rattle inside the shells. Then you crack the shells open, There's various ways to do this. You can either use the old-fashioned method, which is you put a few handfuls in a Hessian sack and you smash it against the wall, and that cracks them all at once. You just whack it really hard against the wall. You can take your angst out on them at the same time. Or these days you can buy a machine to do it. And I've actually got a hand-operated one that is made in Turkey. It's not by any means a sort of something that you would sit on the countertop and would look nice among your other white goods. It's a very Heath Robinson thing. It's all made of sheet metal, spot welded together, with a winding handle on the side and a big sort of rough cog in the middle and a chute on the top. And you feed the acorns in, turn the handle, and it cracks all the shells for you. And once they're dry, they're not very thick. So once they're dried, you just rub them between your hands and press hard, and the shells break and come off. The leaching stage, easier to show you on the next slide, involves grinding the acorns, there they are top left, into a coarse meal. And the coarse meal is bottom left. And you can see there it's looking wet because I've poured water all over it. And what you do is you cover it with water and stir it with a wooden spoon for a couple of minutes. And then you tip the water off half a day later and put more water in and repeat the process. So really once or twice, ideally twice a day, you're going to fill the bucket with water, stir it. And then, 12 hours later, tip the water off and do it again. And you do that for about a week. And the reason you do this is because the acorns are very high in tannins. There's too many tannins in them. And so to eat them, even though a little bit of tannin is actually quite good for you, to eat them in the quantity that they're found in the acorns could cause bellyache, maybe a few other unpleasant symptoms. They'd be regarded as mildly toxic until the tannins were leached out. But once they are leached out, and you know this because you can taste some of the meal and there's no bitterness left in it, and you tip the water off and there's very little color in the water, then what you need to do is lay them out in sheets, maybe on baking trays or something like that, and do it in a low fan oven, or maybe in a commercial dehydrator or something if you've got access to it, or maybe in steel trays on top of your Aga or on top of your wood burner. There's lots and lots of ways you can come up with. You need to dry that wet meal out. And once it's fully dry, it will store in storage jars, Kilner jars, but it stores better in a really cool place because the fats in the acorn after 3 or 4 months can start to go off. So if you put it in a fridge, it will keep for a year, maybe 18 months, no problem. But if you just keep it in a warm room, it might only have a shelf life of 3 or 4 months. And you can use this coarse acorn meal to make cookies, biscuits, cakes, bread. Particularly, it doesn't leaven very well, and it also hasn't got any gluten in it. So if you want to make gluten-free bread, you'd mix xanthan gum or some other binder with it, and it makes perfectly good bread, a bit like a dark rye or something like that. You can also make a hot porridge as well with it. You can make a hot gruel, which you can sweeten with honey. Or you can roast it or toast it under the grill in your oven and make acorn coffee, which you would then use like filter coffee. So it's very, very versatile. It's free. It's extremely abundant in some years, to the point where if you stored it carefully, you could make enough, maybe pick enough for 2 years in a row. And it's incredibly rich in protein. It's a very, very good free food source. Dopamine, what's this all about? Well, again, I don't want to teach anybody to suck eggs, so some of you may already know this, but when we are engaged in activities that are kind of life-affirming and that feel good, our brain releases quite a lot of a neurotransmitter chemical called dopamine. And dopamine not only makes us feel great, but also it reinforces the behavior that we're doing. Dopamine was probably evolved because we're animals as a way of keeping us doing things that kept our species alive. Okay, so when you forage for food, you get a dopamine release. This has now been proven and measured. You get a distinct spike in dopamine in the brain and in the blood when you forage for food. When you engage in social activities that bond the community group together, also when you're engaged in sexual activity, again, because breeding was about furthering the species. So obviously dopamine is going to be produced to encourage you to breed. It's purely a sort of a biological mechanism which rewards certain behaviors, which promote species survival. But dopamine is also a powerful antidepressant. And the fact that we can cause a dopamine release just by the act of foraging means that foraging in and of itself can relieve depression. I think this is one of the reasons why people get so hooked on foraging, because once you go out a few times, you're getting the fresh air, you're getting the exercise, you're seeing new things, you're smelling new things, you're learning about things and trying to identify them and wondering what they're going to taste like. But also you're getting associated with all of those things, you're getting a spike in your dopamine levels, which is rewarding those behaviors. And there is an antidepressant activity connected with that. And I found out, which is why the bee is there, this bee is foraging, okay? And even bees in their tiny bee brains produce dopamine when they're foraging on flowers. It is ubiquitous. It is found throughout the animal kingdom as a reward release mechanism, okay? So one of the ways that we can encourage our own dopamine release is just to get out there with the seasons and try to decode all of the different things we can eat out there in the wild and just get out and forage and eat them. It's good for us and it's good for our mood and well-being. So I don't need to take you back to the tree of life, except to look at the bottom right-hand side. Can you see the word fungi and the word animalia, bottom right? And in the late 1980s, geneticists figured out that the fungi and the animals were actually closely related. And if you look, these two groups, the fungi and the animals, go to one single junction on the tree of life. So if you imagine this was a mighty oak tree with Luca, that ancestral being that we know nothing about, at the base, the point where the acorn originally germinated in the soil. You've got 7 branches away from Luca, and you're out now at the tips of the branches on the tree where the leaves are made. That's where we are today. That's the animalia, we're animals. And that's where the fungi are today. But you go back a little way into history, approximately 1.2 billion years, maybe 1.5 billion years, the fungi and the animals are all derived from one common ancestor. And that common ancestor is a single species of what we call a protofungus. So all animals alive on Earth today, whether you're a sea cucumber, a flea, human being or a cat, and all fungi today alive on Earth, whether you're a bread mold, a yeast fermenting beer, a fly agaric mushroom, a chicken of the woods, all fungi and all animals are evolved from a single species, a common single species ancestor. And because of this, the technical term for this is that we are a monophyletic clade, because we are all derived from a single ancestral species. And some venerable old biologist in the late 1980s said, I know, I'll name them the opisthocons. So we're all a bunch of opisthocons. So what I've got to say to that. Who's seen these in their lawn? Have you seen these dark green rings appearing in your lawn ever? And sometimes out in the fields, maybe when you're walking your dog. What are they? We call them fairy rings. In France, these are le rond de sorcière, the sorcerer's ring. And in some other European languages, they translate it as the witch's ring, the magician's ring. So there's all this folklore about these rings maybe being made by people practicing magic, treading in circles with their magic wand, performing incantations under the full moon, or maybe by fairies trying to lure in unsuspecting shepherds so that they would go and spend 7 years in fairyland or whatever. There are all of these folkloric motifs around these rings. But actually, there's something quite different, not surprisingly. Here's a pretty nice picture of one. And at the right time of the year, that's what happens. These rings fruit, they produce mushrooms. What's actually going on here is that some mushroom spores would have landed in the middle of where the ring is now and produced mycelium, which is the part of the fungal organism that lives in the soil. And the mycelium grows and grows and grows, gradually as it does so, digesting and composting things like dead grass at the base of the grass, base of the turf. And eventually, a patch of mycelium will come across another patch of mycelium that it is sexually compatible with. And this is very important because some fungal species have thousands of sexes. Not all of those sexes are sexually compatible with all the other sexes. But if they're sexually compatible, they fuse together. And what happens is that the new cells of the new mycelium that is produced when they fuse together have two nuclei, two sets of chromosomes, two sets of everything. But instead of those nuclei fusing and producing just one set of chromosomes, they've got two of everything. And this new sexually potent mycelium, as it continues to grow, and it's much more vigorous, by the way, than the mycelium was before it fused, is capable of producing mushrooms because these are the fruiting bodies. This is part of the sexual reproductive cycle of the fungi. What you see here is around the feeding tips of the mycelium growth. This is the mycelium colony within this circle. Around the feeding tips where it's conquering new territory and acquiring fresh nutrients, it has enough energy to produce fruiting bodies. But think about a portobello mushroom that you get from the supermarket. It's got gills right underneath. You turn it over and it's got these dark brown, almost black gills underneath. Well, if you were to look at those gills under a microscope, they're covered in tiny cells called basidia. And each one of those cells has at its tip, in the case of the mushrooms in the supermarket, it's got two little horns. But if you look under the microscope of the same basidia cells of many of these mushrooms, they've actually got four little horns. And on the tips of those horns, that's where the spores are made. And it is only at that point that the nuclei fuse and one brand new set of chromosomes is made. So the spore contains just one set of everything back again to the original state. Once the mycelium had fused in the soil, all cells contained two of everything, two sets of DNA, two sets of chromosomes, two nuclei. But once these spores are produced on the gills of the mushroom fruit body, the whole genetic material has fused together and produced new variants, and these spores contain just one set of everything all over again. And there they are, ready to blow off into the wind and start a brand new colony. So the reproductive cycle of the fungus, the sex life of the fungus, is really long-winded. It starts in the soil, but the mating act only finishes when the mushroom opens and it sheds its spores. It's a very, very long-winded process. One single mushroom, again, think about a portobello from the supermarket, produces about somewhere in the region of 2 billion spores, okay? And every one of those little basidia cells with its little horns on top produces identical clones. So if you've got 2 billion spores, then you've got 500 million different new strains coming from just one mushroom. That's mind-boggling, isn't it? Okay. And of course, most of those spores out in nature are never successful. There are many types of soil bacteria and even other fungi that predate on them as soon as they start to germinate. They just plug into the food chain. They provide more food for the food chain. And then, of course, if you get a patch of mycelium, it gets eaten by slugs and soil invertebrates. And not many of them ever get to complete the full cycle, which is probably just as well. Otherwise, it would be like a scene out of some 1950s B movie, and we'd all be floating around on 6 meters of mushroom blobs trying to get around our business around the earth, because they would take over. Under the microscope, this is what mycelium looks like. It's a somewhat similar to a neural network that you would find in the brain or around the heart, for example, a branching neural network, but also some astrophysicists have pointed out that there are these intergalactic threads of energy pervading the cosmos like great corridors, and the structure is also very, very similar, which I just find intriguing, if nothing else. So from the micro level to the extreme macro level. Fungus mycelium is also currently regarded as the world's largest living thing. One patch, and this is honey fungus, by the way, we're talking about, the thing that wipes out your flagpole cherry trees, etc., in the middle of the lawn in the garden. One patch found in the temperate rainforest in Oregon, USA, covers 2.3 square miles. And we know it's all one mycelium patch because you can take genetic samples anywhere on that patch and they are completely identical. It's estimated to be 2,200 years old. And to be honest, we don't really go around genetically sampling mycelium patches and figuring out how big they are. So probably there are vastly bigger ones in vastly bigger areas of forest that are as yet undiscovered, and we may never discover them. They may be wiped out before we even locate them. Things I do with mushrooms. I like to pickle them. If anyone wants to Google for Fred the Forager's blog, there's a recipe for pickled mushrooms on there, which is not copied, not exactly plagiarized, but strongly inspired by one found in one of Antonio Carluccio's books, bless him, because he really did have a passion for mushrooms, and probably ought to be included on my list of inspirations at the beginning, actually. But what you're seeing in front of you here are pickled oak milkcaps. These are a mushroom that grows in deciduous forests like the ones we get here in Wiltshire, like Savernake Forest, under oak trees. And they're pickled by boiling in a vinegar and saltwater brine for about 8 to 10 minutes. And then they're ladled out, allowed to air dry, put into jars that have been sterilized in the oven. You pour olive oil over the top, include peppercorns and bay leaves and rosemary, and just let them stand and mature in a cool, dark cupboard for a couple of months. And it preserves them, and they keep for 12 to 18 months like that. They're delicious, just served raw as part of a salad. We're getting quite near the end now. Thought I'd show you some dangerous mushrooms. First of all, this is the death cap that we spoke about earlier. I want you to notice that it comes from a kind of an egg-like appendage at the base, and this is known as the vulva. The mushrooms in the death cap family have white gills that are not joined to the stem, and they come from this vulval sac, which is actually a bit like an egg. So when it was a button mushroom and it was tiny, it was completely surrounded by this egg, which burst open when the mushroom came up out of the top and then the cap expanded. And some of these mushrooms, if you recall the red one with white spots on top, the fly agaric, those white spots are also the remains of that egg that the mushroom burst out from. And that's also a member of the death cap family. But this one in front of you here in the slide is the actual death cap. And recently I had a foraging walkout with me and somebody said, is that a real death cap? And I said, yeah, that's a real death cap. Okay, I'm going to get this mushroom ID app on my phone running and we'll see what it says. And this mushroom ID app was top of the range. I'm not going to say the name because it's unprofessional, but it's the best known one. And lo and behold, it did come up with the death cap, but only as the second mushroom in the list. And the first mushroom in the list was an edible mushroom. So on the back of that, I've even wrote a poem about it, and I now call it the death app mushroom, because it appears that even common mushroom ID apps get this mushroom, which is probably the deadliest mushroom on planet Earth, wrong, and will instead tell you that it is a leucoagaricus, which is actually an edible mushroom. How terrifying is that? This is a choice edible, though. This is porcini, Boletus edulis. We also call it the penny bun because of the bun-like coloration and shape of the cap, even down to its kind of pale edge around the edge of the cap, a bit like a bread bun when you bake it and you get this lovely brown crust on top, then it goes paler down the sides. And actually, there are 4 different mushrooms called porcini in Italy. This is only one of them. They're all very closely related, though. And you can buy dried porcini in Waitrose, but it may surprise you to learn that the porcini found in Waitrose were genetically analyzed by the mycologists at Kew Gardens, and they discovered that there were no porcini in the packets. And in fact, these were all related to porcini, but they were species foraged for in China. And they actually found that there were 5 different species in the packets, 2 of which had never been described by science before. Okay, so they were unnamed species that had never been named. Luckily, they were all close relatives of porcini, the set. And so there was nothing toxic in the packet or anything else. But it just goes to show you that people in that part of the world will be being paid by the kilo to forage for something that they've been shown in a picture. And that in itself is quite scary. And for some big events in the past, I've bought mushrooms in bulk, where I've been, my partner and I have been serving canapes to an audience of 400 people. We've bought from companies like Fine Foods, Covent Garden, or Eurofresh, which are suppliers of the restaurant trade. And we ourselves have unpacked those mushrooms from the trays and found small numbers, very small numbers, but of toxic species mixed in among them. Okay, so, you know, you have been warned. Not every chef can ID mushrooms, and people are being paid to pick these things by the kilo, and they may not be able to ID them either. Here's another choice edible. This one's really popular in Spain and is also widely pickled in northeastern Europe and in Poland. And we've had Spanish people out on our courses, and they go, just show us where the orange mushroom is, the crunchy orange mushroom. That's the one we want to find. They're not interested in the porcini. They want this one, the saffron milk cap, that bleeds a carrot-colored milk when you break it. And it grows under Scots pine trees, and only under Scots pine trees, because its mycelium connects to the root systems of the Scots pine, and it's involved with breaking down all the pine needles and things and feeding the nutrients directly back into the roots of that tree. And in return, the tree feeds it carbohydrate-rich sap made by the process of photosynthesis each day so that it can produce more mycelium. And mushrooms that plug into tree root systems like this increase the feeding area, the surface feeding area of trees by an astonishing 480,000 times. Okay, so if you were to unravel the root system of this Scots pine tree, it would go around a few tennis courts. But if you were to unravel the mycelium threads, these tubular cells that I showed you in the microscope slide, if you were to unravel those just from one tree, they would reach all the way to the moon and back to Earth again. And one pinch of that soil around that pine tree contains 7 miles of them. Okay. They also produce water during this composting process that they're a part of. They don't just gather water, they produce it. So they protect the trees from drought through the summer, because as long as the trees are plugged into a good underground fungal mycelial system, they're getting water directly from the fungi. And this is a late season. These are around at the moment, both in pine plantation, spruce plantation, typical forestry commission timber plantation woods, but also out in broadleaf woodland under oak and beech. This is the wood bluet. Reasonably easy to identify from its color, but beware specimens that have got a little rusty ring zone around the top of the stem, because those are a different mushroom. If you're really in doubt, you should cut the cap off and put the gills downwards on a piece of dark colored cardboard overnight to take a spore print. And the spore print should be a very pale pinkish buff color and not a dark rusty brown color, which is the color of the spore print of its imposter, which would be a web cap. You don't want to eat those. They're bad for your kidneys. In some cases, fatally bad. But with the wood bluet, as long as you do that spore print and you have a very faint, pale, pinkish buff spore print, you know you've got the right mushroom. If it's got this kind of coloration and you've got that color spore print, you're good to go. Also, if you smell underneath the cap, there is a smell somewhere in between perfume and sort of floral perfume with a hint of really cheap orange juice concentrate. There's a kind of burnt orange juice smell about that cheap concentrate. And if you mix that with cheap perfume, you've got the smell that comes off of the gills and the base of the stem of this mushroom. And if you find a patch, cut the stem bases off and go and bury them in deep leaves in the bottom of your garden, because they will actually grow back and grow new mycelium patches. And you can get them growing in your garden too. They're delicious, but they must be well cooked. If they're undercooked, or raw, they can cause stomach cramps. And perhaps finally, on the mushroom front, we often hear about magic mushrooms, but I think you should be getting the gist now that I believe that all mushrooms are magic in their own way, because of the roles that they play within the ecosystem, because of the fact that they are food for so many different types of animals, that they assist trees and even cereal crops in their life cycle of gathering nutrients and resisting infections from pests and diseases and drought, but also because a great many of them are medicinal to human beings, not just the ones you see in front of you. The red one with the white spots to the left is actually used in Northern European folk medicine and herbal medicine to make a tincture which actually cures sciatic pain. It is actually a topical pain relief that's put on the skin, and it plugs into the GABA nerve receptors, GABA type A and C receptors, similar to the drug gabapentin. It brings about pain relief that travels down the sciatic nerve. So it's amazing for sciatica. And of course, currently on the right here, we have the psilocybin mushrooms, the liberty cap, which there's a huge underground culture of people, taking these for recreation, but actually there are clinical trials taking place involving these mushrooms at Imperial College in London, several American universities, and also in Switzerland and Canada, where it's being used to see if it's got decent potential for treating depression, anorexia, alcohol addiction, and a whole range of other ailments that have got a psychological component. And so far, the results are very, very impressive. So there is a very strong likelihood that this mushroom will be legalized for medicinal use sometime over the next 10 years. And it's already being legalized in the USA, state by state as we speak. Anyone who collects fungi needs to learn how to preserve them. So I've just listed there for when you go back to looking at this at home after you play the slideshow back again, just a reminder to say that you can preserve fungi by drying them, and that they will keep for up to 12 years if you dry them, as long as you keep them in a dry, cool, dark environment. They can be pickled and they will keep sort of for 12 months that way. They can be incorporated into vodka and used as the basis for liqueurs. This is a very popular practice in Russia. Obviously, vodka is very popular in Russia too. So things like beefsteak mushrooms, chanterelles, even truffles are used to flavor liqueurs and also give them distinct coloration. They can be dried and powdered to make stock. One puffball, one giant puffball, the big white one like a football that grows in the fields, will make 1 litre to 1.5 litres of stock powder. That's enough to use a stock powder for an entire year just from one dried mushroom. And just to put all of this that we've been talking about in some kind of a perspective, the annual harvest in Finland, and this has come from the Finnish Forestry Authority, the annual harvest of mushrooms in Finland averages 10,000 tons. And in a good year, it may reach 45,000 tons of dried mushrooms. And this is from a country, obviously, that's much more afforested than the UK and with a much smaller population, per area. So the impact is considerably lower. But the majority, over 90% of those 10 to 45,000 tons of mushrooms are exported to the rest of Europe for use in the restaurant trade. Only 10 to 15% are retained at home for the domestic market or by the people harvesting them at home for pickling and drying for their own use, which is quite interesting. There have been a number of scientific studies that have shown that picking mushroom fruit bodies, the mushrooms themselves, does not actually diminish the mycelium in any way. And it does also not, it doesn't prejudice the mycelium towards fruiting less in the future. And in fact, in some cases may make it fruit slightly harder. But the mycelium itself, providing the habitat doesn't change, i.e. the tree species that are present, the drainage patterns, the way the land is used, all the things that we're interested in from a conservation perspective. Providing those things don't change, a patch of mycelium can live for many thousands of years. It's practically immortal. If you cut a piece out, it will just grow back in to fill the gap and start all over again. And so really the mushrooms are in control. They're vitally important steps in any ecosystem. Ecosystems break without the fungi on board. And the thing is, the mycelium is invisible to the naked eye for most of us most of the time. So everyone talks about what will happen to ecosystems when we lose the bees or the pollinators. Losing the mycelium from the soil is every bit as important, if not more so. They are a rate determining step in most ecosystems and food webs. But yeah, they are in control of the passage of nutrients between the plants and through the soil. They are actually governing the movement of food within the sort of trophic pyramids. They're very, very important, and we must not lose them. So if you want to learn some more, you can look me up on the web, thewildsideoflife.co.uk. We've got lots of courses. Some of them at the moment, I'm kind of a little bit behind putting next year's dates online. They should be going online within the next week or so on the website. There are one-day mushroom courses. There are spring foraging courses for shoots and, you know, the sorts of things that we talked about, making the spring cure and all the rest of it. In the summer, I've got a herbal medicine summer school where you can learn herbal first aid or learn about herbs and mushrooms to support your immune system. So lots going on. And also next autumn, if you're interested in the medicinal side of the fungi, then open to the public, we have the 7th UK and Ireland Medicinal Mushrooms Conference, which will be held at Stanton Park near Swindon, Stanton Fitzwarren, on the 18th and 19th of November 2023. And there's a mini market there selling mushroom grow blocks. You can do a workshop and inoculate your own mushroom logs with shiitakes and turkey tail mushrooms and things. And there'll be growers and scientists and herbalists and all sorts of people from different perspectives doing talks and presentations on the use of mushrooms as medicinal raw materials around the world. But there will also be a lot of foragers present at the conference, maybe as speakers, but also in the audience, because it's something that we tend to be, you know, we tend to be much of a muchness. We don't just forage for food. Most of us tend to be interested in foraging for our medicine as well. And really, that's my slideshow. So I'm going to do that. And it says my screen sharing has stopped. Can you all see me again?
Hi, yeah, Fred, we can. We're all back. Thank you so much, Fred. That was an incredible amount of information. It was so comprehensive. We covered, so I can't believe the journey we've been on from intergalactic mycelium and beyond. I'm already looking forward to my spring cure soup. I was making me really hungry for that.
Well, we can make some of that down at Hazeland, can't we?
Wouldn't that be fantastic? Yeah, absolutely wonderful. Really, really great. Yeah. Because it was such a comprehensive talk and a lot longer than our usual talks that we have.
I'm sorry, I did run on a little bit. I'm sorry about that.
There was so much packed into it. It was incredible. So if people do have questions, what I'm going to do is direct them to the Wild Side of Life website and say, go on one of Fred's talks and actually kind of live this out and about in the world. Yeah, and look out for the Fred's events coming up hopefully at Hazeland next year, which we're really hoping to coordinate. That would be fantastic. I just want to do a quick plug. This isn't to do with foraging or taking things out of the ground, it's to do with putting things in the ground. So if anybody does want to get out and about in this, it's going to be frosty and clear the next few days and hopefully beyond. We are tree planting at Hazeland, which is our site between Carn and Chippenham. Avon trees are carrying on with our woodland there in December, and we'll be carrying on with our Puddingbrook Wood site nearer Chippenham Way in January. So if people are interested in getting involved with the tree planting side of Avon Needs Trees, then do head to our website avonneedstrees.org.uk and sign up to get out tree planting. And that is also where you'll see more news about Fred's days at Hazeland and be able to catch up with his online talk. We'll be posting it on the website in the next few days. If you want to go back and check out any of those recipes or share it with friends who couldn't come along, this evening, please do so. So thanks everyone for coming along this evening.
Lovely.
Thanks again, Fred, so much. And
can I just say, if you browse onto my website, folks, my contact details are on there. Please do get in touch if you've got any questions. It's no problem. Drop me an email or something if there's something you want to ask. And I really hope you enjoyed the talk. Thanks, everybody.
There've been lots of comments popping up in the little chat box about how interesting and fascinating and well received it was. So thanks, everyone. Stay safe and stay warm. Okay.
Yeah. Okay, take care. I'm going to dip out now as well.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Good night.
Night night.